This is Softwareable Bytes. Hello and welcome to another episode of Softwareable Bytes. This is the show where I read to you articles and blog posts on subjects like software and cloud engineering and architecture, site reliability engineering, DevOps, and everything in between. If you are looking for software and cloud development services and training, check out softwareable.com. We help customers in their software and cloud journey, whether it's taking software from ideas to complete solutions, migrating existing systems to the cloud, or mentoring and training individuals and teams. We make it work for your needs. Go to softwareable.com, that's software without the E, IBLE.com to learn more. In today's episode, I have an article titled The Top 3 Mistakes Companies Make with SLOs, SLAs, and SLIs by Cortex.io. The top 3 mistakes companies make with SLOs, SLAs, and SLIs by Cortex.io. We see teams fall into a few common traps with SLOs, SLIs, and SLAs, particularly when they're just starting out. In this article, we'll first define these 3 acronyms. It's easy to get confused, and show you how to avoid the mistakes other teams make. What are SLOs, SLAs, and SLIs? SLOs are your service level objectives. When your team decides internally that you have a goal of 99.99% uptime for a service, you are setting an SLO. And to know that you are hitting that SLO, you need to measure your uptime. When you attach metrics to an SLO, these states get acronymized, a real word apparently, and become your SLIs, or service level indicators. For example, your site's response rates and error rates could be SLIs if they tell you whether you are hitting your SLOs of super fast response rates and super low error rates, presumably. Finally, your SLAs are the service level agreements that you've made with customers and are legally bound to uphold. For every SLA, you'll want to have an SLO that you track internally. On the other hand, your SLOs don't need to correspond to SLAs. They can just be ways for your team to track the health of your product. To sum it up, SLOs are the objectives you measure for your services. SLIs are the indicators of how you are doing on those objectives. SLAs are the agreements you make with customers. Mistakes companies make with SLOs, SLIs, and SLAs. We see teams make a few common mistakes with SLOs, SLIs, and SLAs, particularly when they are just starting out. 1. Unnecessary SLOs. There's a lot of different monitoring tools out there, and many of them can help automatically set SLOs for your services. It can be tempting to monitor all of the SLOs, but if you have an SLO, you're going to want to have an alert for when it fails. And if you have an alert when it fails, you're going to be nagging your team to fix it. And if you're nagging your team, it's like the engineering nightmare version of if you give a mouse a cookie. So it's important to proceed with caution when it comes to defining your SLOs. Before you get tempted to set an SLO around, say, your server's data processing throughput, you should ask yourself, do I actually need this SLO? Does it map to an SLA, something that we promise to our customers? If not, does this SLO correspond to a core business objective? Does this represent whether our product is working? Or are we just trying to check a box? In our experience, a lot of engineers have learned somewhere along the line, maybe in the previous jobs at Google or Facebook, that you cannot launch a service without tracking certain SLOs that were designed for and popularized by large companies. So they end up focusing on SLOs that aren't actually important for the stage that their service is at and don't make an impact for their end users. And these SLOs end up diverting time and energy from the team's actual goals. Your monitoring should serve your team, not the other way around. On a related note, beware of the pitfall of over-optimizing your SLOs for minimal returns. According to Google, users cannot distinguish between 100 millisecond and 300 millisecond refresh and might accept any point between 300 milliseconds and 1000 milliseconds, adopting SLOs. And it is generally recognized that achieving the next 9 in availability costs you 10 times as much as the preceding one. Defining SLOs. 2. Tracking vanity SLIs instead of business goals. Like your SLOs, your SLIs should correspond to what your product is trying to achieve at a high level. We commonly see teams tracking SLIs like uptime and error rate across all their services because it seemed like a good idea. But SLIs aren't one-size-fits-all metrics. Especially when you're a small company, you should view your SLIs as an opportunity to identify what really matters for your team and stakeholders. It helps to start by considering the core user journeys that you want to support in your product. For example, you might have an essential feature where users upload files to import data into your product. If users cannot upload files, or if the experience is very slow, this key user journey fails. Therefore, it would make sense to track SLIs around latency and failure rates for this particular service, but not for an ordinary asynchronous background process. Along the same lines, you might decide that if the health of your top 5 endpoints looks good, you can safely ignore random 500s elsewhere. When you focus on metrics that directly relate to user engagement, you might find you can afford to be more flexible on your reporting. If you are a 5-person team with a small user base, maybe you don't need to set up alerting yet. Reporting on certain metrics once a week might be enough. This frees up your team to focus on all the other aspects of business, so that if you're lucky, you'll have a good reason to worry a lot more about SLIs later on. 3. Lack of visibility and ownership around SLOs. One of the problems with SLOs is ownership and responsibility. Usually, an engineering manager or a software reliability engineer, if there is an SRE team, will be responsible for managing the SLOs and setting up alerts for your on-call rotation. But it's likely that the on-call engineer won't know anything about the service the SLO corresponds to and who is responsible for it. That's why at Cortex, we put services and their owners first-class citizens and support SLO integrations out of the box. Finally, by putting SLOs front and center in our service catalog, engineers can better educate themselves on the health of their services. The service owner can immediately see how their SLOs are looking instead of needing the SRE. The service owner can immediately see how their SLOs are looking instead of needing the SRE to come and tell them when something goes wrong. By surfacing this information, you can avoid tribalism on your team and create a culture where there is shared responsibility instead of blame and resentment. You just listened to the top 3 mistakes companies make with SLOs, SLAs, and SLIs by Cortex.io. The article laid out some of the common mistakes when it comes to SLIs and SLOs. I know sometimes engineers tend to forget that SLIs and SLOs tend to be more of customer-facing measurements and be prone to focusing on the technicality of it all. That usually happens when the focal point is on the elements of the system, such as the database, the load balancer, etc., while it should be on the system boundary. That's where the system capabilities are exposed to the customer. And with that, let's check the tool of the day. kubectl is the primary tool that most of us use to interact with Kubernetes clusters. One thing that it doesn't have is a built-in command to display related Kubernetes objects in a cluster. That's where today's tool, kubectl-tree, comes in. It helps in exploring ownership relationships between Kubernetes objects through owners' references on them. For example, which controller revision is used by daemon set and stateful set for updates and rollbacks. It's available through crew plugin manager. Just run kubectl crew install tree. To learn more, search for kubectl tree on GitHub or visit the link to it in the description of this episode. And that should do it for another episode of Softwareable Bytes. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you here again in the next episode.